For 7 years, I fed my mom, bathed her, learned the name of every pill. My brother and sister never called. Not on her birthday. Not at Christmas. Not on the last day, when I held her hand and she stopped knowing mine. At the will reading, my sister took the house, the china. Then she read my line like a punchline. You get the dishes. The chipped, everyday ones. The whole room laughed. I just smiled because I knew something they didn't. Then the lawyer set down a second envelope, my mother's handwriting on the front. He read one number, $2 million. Beneath it, a single sentence. My sister, still laughing, stopped breathing. And the laughing stopped for good. My name is Frances Hargrove. This is what my mom did while everyone was busy forgetting her. I'm going to tell you what that single sentence said. All of it. The 7 years, the dishes, the 2 million, and the thing my mother understood that the rest of us were too busy to see. But if you've ever been the one who stayed while everyone else just visited, do me one favor. Stay with me now. Subscribe and don't drift off, because the part that matters most doesn't come at the beginning. It comes at the very end, in a room nobody thought I'd be standing in. Let me take you back. Back 7 years, to a house on a quiet street in Wexford, Georgia, and a set of dishes nobody else in my family wanted. Every morning started the same way. I'd put the kettle on, and while it heated, I'd take down 2 plates from the second shelf, the plain white ones, thick at the rim, one of them chipped where it had cracked against the faucet years before my mother ever got sick. I'd warm her oatmeal and tap the spoon twice against the side of her bowl, because by the end, that little sound was how she knew it was time to eat. 2 taps. Then she'd find her way to the table. The good dishes lived behind glass in the dining room. Bone china with a gold edge, a wedding set my mother had carried through 3 houses and never once eaten off. 40 years that china sat in the cabinet, waiting for company that didn't come. Use the everyday ones, Frances, she told me, the first week I moved back in. The good ones are for people we're trying to impress. We're not trying to impress anybody at this table. She set her hand over mine on the chipped plate. Use the everyday ones. They know our hands. I was 42 when I moved into that house. Divorced. Working as a home health aide, which in my family was a job you mentioned quietly, if you mentioned it at all. My sister Celeste was the one they bragged about. My brother Russell did something with commercial real estate 2 states away. And me? I was the one who'd married wrong and worked with my hands and didn't have a husband or a title to put in the Christmas letter. There's a word a family uses for someone like me, even when they're too polite to say it out loud. I was the stain, the smudge on an otherwise spotless name. The daughter you explained. It started young. I was the one who got the scholarship to art school and let it go. The one who married a man my late father called, to his face, a project. The one whose marriage ended loud enough that the whole town heard the worst of it. By the time I was in my mid-30s, I had a divorce behind me, a job that involved other people's medications and other people's bad days, and no children to soften the picture. And in a family that measured a person's worth in appearances, that made me a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be known. At holidays, I got seated, politely, a little apart. In conversations, I was the subject that got changed. I learned to read a room the way I would later learn to read my mother's face, watching for the small tightening that meant my name had come up and somebody wished it hadn't. So when our mother started forgetting where she'd set her glasses, then forgetting whether she'd eaten, then forgetting the names of the street she'd lived on her whole life, nobody had to debate who would handle it. It was understood, the way the weather is understood. Frankie's between things right now, I heard Celeste tell an aunt on the phone. She has the time, between things, as if the 7 years I gave my mother were a gap in my real life. As if changing sheets at 2 a.m. and learning to crush 9 different pills into applesauce and sitting up through fevers was something I did because I had nothing better to fill the hours. There was a night in the 3rd year, I remember it because it was the night I stopped expecting help, when she went down in the bathroom in the small hours. She wasn't hurt, just wedged between the tub and the wall, too turned around to get her legs under her, and too proud, even then, to want me to see her like that. It took the better part of an hour to get her up and warm and back into bed, talking the whole time in the low, level voice you'd use with a frightened animal. When she was finally asleep, I sat down on the cold tile floor of that bathroom and called my sister's cell. It was the middle of the night. I knew she wouldn't answer. I called anyway, and I listened to it ring through to her bright, recorded voice telling me to leave a message, and I didn't leave one. I just sat there with the phone against my ear, listening to the silence after the beep, learning something I should have already known. That was the shape of all of it. Me on the floor in the dark, and a voicemail 2 states away. I learned which floorboards creaked so I could cross her room without waking her. I learned to read her face when the words ran out on her, the way you learn a second language late in life, slowly and out of love, and because you have no other choice. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand what it costs to be the one who stays, and how completely invisible that cost is to the people who don't. My sister, meanwhile, had a name everyone in Wexford knew. Celeste Hargrove ran the Hargrove Foundation, the family's charitable trust, our grandfather's legacy, the thing that put the Hargrove name on the new wing of the library and the scholarship plaques at the high school. She cut ribbons. She gave the speech at the spring gala. When the local paper wanted a quote about community, they called Celeste. She'd come by the house maybe twice a year, always with a photographer's eye for it, always with somewhere to be in 40 minutes. She never sat down to a meal, but she'd stand in the kitchen with her coat still on and tell our mother, "Don't you worry about the foundation's books, Mama. I'll handle everything." And our mother would nod and pat her hand. And the moment Celeste's car pulled out of the driveway, the house would go quiet again, and it would just be the 2 of us. I want to be fair. For a long time, I told myself my brother and sister were busy. People are busy, but somewhere in year 4, I stopped getting calls back at all. Not on Mom's birthday, not at Christmas. The phone in that house could go a month without ringing for her, and she'd still ask me, some evenings, whether I thought the kids might visit. I always said maybe. She always set out a 3rd cup the next morning, just in case. I'd quietly put it back. There was one thing I never asked about. Starting about 3 years ago, a gray car began turning up in our driveway. Not often, a handful of times a year. A man in a gray sedan, dark suit, a leather folder under his arm, and he'd sit with my mother at the dining room table, at the good dishes, of all places, the only time those plates ever got used, and they'd talk in low voices, and then he'd leave. I asked her once who he was. "Just a friend, baby," she said, and she patted my hand the way she patted Celeste's, helping me get a few things in order. A gray car I never asked about. The last morning, the kettle was the only sound in the house. I made 2 cups of coffee out of habit, the way I had for 7 years, and carried them to the table, and only when I set them down did I understand she wasn't going to drink hers. She was awake. Her eyes were open, but when I put the chipped cup in front of her, the one she'd used every single day, she looked at it like it belonged to a stranger. I sat down across from her. I told her it was a good morning, that the light was coming in nice. She watched me the way you watch someone speaking a language you used to know. I buttered a piece of toast and cut it into the small squares she could still manage, and set it on the chipped plate in front of her, and waited. She didn't reach for it. Her hand stayed folded in her lap. Outside, a car passed, and a dog barked somewhere down the block, and the ordinary morning went on happening all around us while something at that table quietly stopped. Near the end, she said one thing clearly. She'd been somewhere far off, and then she came back for a second, and she looked right at me. "The real things," she said. You already have them, Frances. I thought it was the illness talking. I held her hand and told her yes, I had everything. Don't worry. Her coffee went cold on the table between us. By that afternoon, she was gone. Her coffee went cold. So did the morning. I called my sister first. It went to voicemail. I called my brother. Voicemail. I left messages, the kind you don't want to leave, the kind where your voice does something you can't control. Celeste, it's me. It's time. Please, just call back. I left that one at the hospital, standing in a hallway that smelled like floor cleaner, holding my phone with both hands like it might ring if I held it hard enough. It didn't ring. Not that day. Not until they needed to know the date of the funeral. I kept the phone in my hand through all of it, through the calls to the funeral home, through the kind woman from hospice who came to help me with the paperwork, through the long drive back to a house that was suddenly far too quiet. Every time the screen lit up, something in my chest jumped, and every time it was the funeral director or the church or a neighbor with a casserole and a soft voice. Never my sister, never my brother, the two people who shared her blood, let the news of her death sit in their voicemail like a bill they would get to later. They came back for that. Of course they came back for that. There were people watching, after all. The funeral was on a Tuesday in early March, and half of Wexford came. I stood by the casket in a dress I'd had for 10 years, and I watched a line of people I'd known my whole life come through that church, and not one of them was there for me. They were there for Celeste. They held both her hands. They said the same thing, in different words, over and over, until it stopped sounding like language and started sounding like a song with one note. She carried so much for that woman. I heard a man tell his wife, nodding toward my sister, that woman. He meant my mother. Celeste wore black so well, it looked tailored for the occasion, and maybe it was. She had a way of receiving grief, like a gift she was gracious enough to accept. And at one point, I was close enough to hear it. Someone asked her how the foundation was holding up through all this, and she pressed her hand to her chest and said, "The foundation's never been stronger. It's how I honor her." People I'd known my whole life passed within arm's reach of me and didn't slow down. Mrs. Avery from the church, who had eaten at our table more times than I could count, took both my sister's hands and called her brave. The man who ran the hardware store told Russell what a fine family this was. What a loss to the whole town. A woman I didn't recognize leaned in close to me, kindly, and asked whether I was with the caterer. I told her no. She gave me a small, apologetic smile and moved on toward the line for my sister. I had bathed the woman in that casket. I had held her hand on the last morning of her life and learned the exact weight of her over 7 years. And on the day they put her in the ground, I stood close enough to rest my palm on the lid, and I was the one person in that church nobody could quite place. I stood there with my hand flat on the lid of my mother's casket, and I could not feel the wood under my fingers. Nobody looked at me. For 7 years, I had been the one in the house, and on the one day it might have counted, I was furniture. The whole town came to mourn, and the whole town mourned the wrong daughter. It was at the graveside, after most of them had drifted back to their cars, that one person stayed. Estelle Briggs had lived 2 doors down from my mother for 30 years. An old friend, a widow herself, the kind of neighbor who knows which lights are on in your house at night. She waited until the crowd thinned, and then she came and stood beside me at the open grave and took my hand. Not the way the others had taken Celeste's for show, but hard, the way you grip someone who's standing closer to an edge than they realize. "I saw you every morning, Frances," she said. "The whole street did. I saw you bring the trash cans in and walk her to the mailbox and turn the porch light on for her at dusk." She squeezed once. "Don't you let anybody tell you otherwise. I saw." I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. Someone, at least, had been watching the right door. The reading of the will was 11 days later, in a law office downtown, with leather chairs and a window that looked out on the square. Lewis Calloway was an older man, careful, the kind of lawyer who reads slowly, because the words matter. Celeste arrived early and sat at the head of the table like she'd been assigned the seat. Russell flew in for it. First time I'd seen my brother in over 2 years. And the two of them had the loose, easy posture of people who already know how a story ends. Because they did know. Or thought they did. There was the house, paid off on its corner lot. There were our grandmother's heirlooms, the silver, the bone china behind glass. There was whatever my mother had set aside over a long, frugal life. And Celeste had already done the math on all of it. I could see her doing it even then, her foot tapping under the table, her fingers drumming a quick, restless rhythm on the closed folder in front of her. "See?" she murmured to Russell as Mr. Calloway opened the file. She knew who actually carries this family. He read the house to Celeste. The corner lot, the deed free and clear. A current value that made Russell sit up a little straighter in his chair. He read the bone china and the silver to Celeste, the gold edge set behind the glass, and the flatware in the velvet-lined drawer, with a small share of the personal effects to Russell. He read out a savings account and a certificate of deposit, and the contents of a safe deposit box at the bank on Main Street. He moved through all of it, line by line, in that careful, unhurried voice, and with each line, my sister's shoulders settled lower into satisfaction. I watched the two of them more than I watched the lawyer. Russell had brought a legal pad and was actually keeping a tally, little numbers running down the margin. Like a man pricing out a house, he meant to flip by fall. Celeste didn't need to write anything down. She carried the figures in her head, and I could see her adding them, her foot keeping that quick, restless time under the table, her eyes going soft and far away, the way they did when she was already spending money that wasn't in her hands yet. Neither of them so much as glanced at me. Why would they? I was at the foot of the table in a 10-year-old dress, the daughter who'd get whatever was left over once the real heirs had been seen to. And there was a part of me, I'll be honest with you, a small, worn-down part, that had long ago made its peace with that. 7 years of calls that went to voicemail will do that to a person. I had stopped waiting for the scales to come out even. I had come to that office, more than anything, just to sit in one more room where my mother's name still carried some kind of weight. Then he came to me. "To my daughter Frances," he read, "I leave the everyday dishes." There was a beat of silence while everyone waited for the rest of the sentence. There wasn't any rest of the sentence? That was the whole of it. Celeste read it again out loud because she couldn't believe her luck, and this time she laughed. "You get the dishes." She turned the words over like she was tasting them. "The chipped, everyday ones." Russell laughed. A man I didn't know, somebody from the firm, almost laughed and caught himself. The sound bounced off the walls of that quiet office. I just smiled. I had washed those dishes every morning for 7 years. I knew exactly what they were and exactly what they weren't, and I let them have the laugh. My sister was already moving on. She was talking about listing the house before summer, about getting the silver appraised, about consolidating everything. That was her word, consolidating, like our mother's life was an account to be swept into one place. "We'll get it all squared away fast," she said. "I'll handle everything, like always." She had a notepad out now, beside Russell's, and the two of them put their heads together over it, while their mother's lawyer was still in the room, dividing things up in low voices. Who would take the silver to be appraised, whether the house ought to be painted before it was listed or sold as it stood? Russell wanted to know how soon the savings could be released. Celeste told him not to worry, that she would handle the timeline, that she always handled the timeline. There was a hunger in it, that didn't match the size of the meal in front of them. And sitting at the foot of the table, I felt the first faint prickle of a question I couldn't yet put into words. Why was a woman who had just inherited a house and a fortune in silver behaving like someone who needed cash by the end of the week? And she was in a hurry about it. That's the thing I kept turning over afterward. A woman who'd just been handed a house and a fortune in silver does not need to move fast. But Celeste was leaning forward, already half out of her chair, already reaching for the next thing, and I couldn't make her hurry, fit the size of what she'd won. Mr. Calloway let her get most of the way to standing. "Before you go," he said, and something in how he said it stopped the room. He reached into his file and set a second envelope flat on the table. It was cream-colored, a little worn at one corner, and across the front, in my mother's slanted, careful hand, was a single line of writing. "Your mother left a second envelope," he said. "She asked that this one be opened last." Her handwriting was on the front. So here's where I have to ask you to do something, because I know how this looks from the outside. Picture it from my chair. My sister halfway out of her seat. My brother smirking. A whole life sorted and handed to the two people who hadn't shown up for any of it. And then an old lawyer slides one cream envelope across the table with my mother's handwriting on the front and tells the room it has to be opened last. If you were me, what would you be hoping was inside? Tell me in the comments before you hear it. I'm curious whether you'd have guessed. Then stay with me, because what my mother wrote next is the reason none of those people are laughing today. Mr. Calloway opened it with a letter knife and took out two things: a folded letter and a thin sheaf of legal pages with a notary's seal pressed into the bottom corner. He read from the legal pages first, in that slow voice. What he read was this: 3 years ago, well before the day my mother died, while she was sharp enough to sit across a table and ask hard questions of a man in a gray suit, she had created a trust. Not a line in a will. A separate, formal, irrevocable trust. Set up with the Piedmont Trust Company as trustee. Funded quietly out of assets she'd kept entirely in her own name. The pages noted that her doctors had attested she was of sound mind the week she signed it. She'd seen to that herself, the way she saw to everything, and the trust named one beneficiary. Me. The amount was $2 million. The room did not make a sound. Celeste had gone very still, halfway between sitting and standing, one hand still flat on the table. A man's voice came over the speakerphone. Garrett Lowell, the officer from Piedmont, who'd been waiting on the line. Calm, unhurried, the voice of someone reading from a document he'd read many times. "To confirm for the family," Lowell said, "the trust is irrevocable. It was established 3 years ago and funded at that time. No one can undo it now. Not your sister, not the two of you, not me." A pause. Including me. $2 million, set in stone 3 years ago, by the woman they'd all decided didn't have anything worth leaving to the daughter who didn't count. I watched my sister's face change color before the worst part was even read. Because there was one more line. Mr. Calloway turned to it and read it the same way he'd read everything else. Flat and clear, no weight on any word. "It is the settler's express instruction," he read, "that no portion of this trust, its income, or its principal shall, under any circumstances be used to fund, rescue, loan to, or cover the obligations of the Hargrove Foundation." My sister, still standing, made a small sound, and then she stopped breathing. I mean that. I watched it happen. Her chest, which had been rising and falling fast, simply stopped, and for a second her face was the face of someone who has walked into a wall they could not see in the dark. Russell turned to look at her. Mr. Calloway waited, the way he'd wait for any sentence to settle. My mother had aimed that line. I didn't understand yet why she would forbid rescuing the very foundation her own daughter ran. But you don't write a sentence like that by accident. You write it because you know exactly where it will land, and you wait until you're gone to fire it. For a moment, nobody in that office moved. Russell's pen had stopped dead on his legal pad. The man from the firm was studying the grain of the table like it owed him money. And my sister was still on her feet, one hand flat on the wood, not sitting and not leaving, caught in the exact posture of a person who has just understood that the floor she'd been counting on was never under her at all. Then Mr. Calloway unfolded the letter and handed it to me and said, "She asked that you read this part yourself, Frances. Out loud, if you're able." So I did. The paper was thin, almost weightless, and it shook a little in my hand, and the late light through the office window fell across my mother's handwriting. I read slowly, because her words were not a thing to be hurried through. "My Frances, by the time you hear this, you'll have heard them laugh about the dishes. I'm sorry for that. I let it happen on purpose, and I need you to understand why. You spent your whole life believing you were the one this family could afford to overlook. I let them believe it too. I let them think you stayed because you had nowhere else to be, and that you'd take whatever scraps were left. I did that so I could protect you properly. Because the moment your brother and sister understood there was real money in play, they would have found a way to put their hands on it and on you. So I hid it. I kept it where they couldn't reach, and I kept quiet, and I let you carry the name of the one who didn't matter, knowing all the while that you were the only one of my children who ever did. The dishes are yours because the mornings were ours. Every cup of coffee. Every 2 taps of the spoon. Nobody else was at that table. Nobody else earned those plain white plates. They are not the small thing in this envelope, baby. They are the whole of it. The rest is just money. And one more thing, since I won't be there to say it. Your sister is in trouble of her own making, and it will come out on its own, without any help from you. Don't chase it. Don't lower yourself to it. Just stand still and let the truth do what the truth does. You were always strong enough to wait. I watched you wait 7 years for a phone that never rang. You can wait for this. I saw you, Frances. Every single morning. I saw you. Mama. I sat there with the letter in my lap and the room out of focus around me, and for the first time in my life, in my whole life, I was not the one holding everyone else up. For the first time, I was the one who'd been protected. Out in the hallway afterward, my sister found her voice, and it was a different voice than the one she'd used in the church. She didn't raise it. That wasn't her way. She came close enough that I could see the powder settling in the lines around her mouth, and she spoke low and fast. "You isolated her," Celeste said. "You moved into that house, and you cut her off, and you sat there for 7 years, feeding her your version of things. A judge will see that. Undue influence, that's what it's called when a caretaker manipulates a sick old woman into changing where her money goes." Her fingers were drumming against her thigh now, that same restless rhythm. "Sign the trust over to the estate, Frances, and we keep this quiet. No lawyers, no ugliness. We keep it in the family." There it was. Quiet. She wanted it quiet. I didn't answer her. My mother had told me to stand still, and I was learning, that very minute, how much strength it takes to stand still while someone you share a mother with calls you a thief in a marble hallway. I didn't understand the rest of it until 2 days later, when Estelle called. She'd heard things, the way you hear things in a town like Wexford. And a letter had come to my mother's house by mistake, addressed to the foundation, misrouted to the old family address, and Estelle, who was keeping an eye on the place, had set it aside for me. "The bank's given them a deadline, Frances," Estelle said. "It's bad. The foundation owes money it doesn't have, and the bank gave them until the board meeting to make it right, and their accountant, the woman who kept their books, she quit a few months back, walked away from the whole account. Walter Pennington's beside himself. You know Walter. He's on the board, good man. He doesn't sleep when something's wrong. A clock I hadn't known was running had been running the whole time. I took everything I'd been left and everything Estelle had told me to Mr. Calloway, and we sat with Garrett Lowell on the phone, and the three of us put the pieces on the table. The Hargrove Foundation was not short on cash. It was hollow. There was a hole in it, more than $2 million deep, $2.1 million when you counted it all. And for years, my sister had been quietly papering over that hole, moving money to make the books look like they balanced when they didn't. The gala, the ribbon cuttings, the speeches about legacy, all of it was a face stretched over an empty room. That was why she needed my mother's money. Not greed, exactly. Survival. She was drowning, and the $2 million was the only thing big enough to keep her head above water. I sat with that for a long time, and it rearranged everything behind me. The hurry in the lawyer's office, the way she'd been halfway out of her chair, already reaching for the next thing, the speech at the funeral, hand pressed to her chest, about a foundation that had never been stronger. None of it had been confidence. All of it had been a woman, running just ahead of something that was gaining on her, smiling the whole way so that nobody would think to look at what was behind her. And the longer I sat with it, the clearer it got that she had counted on my mother's money, the way a falling person counts on a rope. She hadn't expected the rope to be cut. She certainly hadn't expected it to be handed, instead, to me. "She isn't greedy, Frances," Garrett Lowell said, and there was no cruelty in how he said it, only fact. "She's drowning, and your mother knew." My mother had known. 3 years ago, at the Good Dishes, with a man in a gray suit, my mother had looked at the daughter the whole town admired and seen straight through her to the empty room. She hadn't needed an accountant for it. She'd heard Celeste promise, year after year, not to worry about the foundation's books, and a woman who'd kept a frugal house her whole life knew that the one who keeps telling you not to look is the one to watch. And she had built a wall around the only thing that could save her, and written one sentence to make sure it stayed walled off. She wasn't short on money. She'd been hiding. "I want to tell you that I did something dramatic next." I didn't. What I did was open a shoebox. For 7 years, being a home health aide is a thing you do with your hands, but it's also a thing you do with paper. Medication logs, doctor's notes, receipts for the pharmacy and the grab bars and the special spoons. I'd kept all of it, out of habit, in a shoebox on the closet shelf, because that's what you do when you're the kind of person whose word might one day be questioned. Dated, initialed. 7 years of mornings, written down. There were photographs in there, too, not staged ones. My mother at the kitchen table in her blue robe, the two of us at Christmas with a small tree and the plain white plates, a note in her own handwriting from a good day that said, "Frances, gone to the store, back by lunch. Don't let me forget I love you." I found that one folded in the bottom of the box and had to set the whole thing down for a while. When I could, I spread it all across the kitchen table. 7 years in paper. The pharmacy printouts with the dates stamped in the corner. The little spiral notebook where I'd written her blood pressure down every morning, 2 and 3 readings a day, page after page in my own cramped hand. The appointment cards from the neurologist in Atlanta. The parking stubs from the garage across from the hospital. The receipt for the second set of grab bars after she outgrew the first. None of it was evidence I had ever meant to use for anything. It was just the residue of showing up, the leftovers of 1,000 ordinary mornings. But laid out like that, edge to edge across the table, it told a story no courtroom on earth could argue with, that on every one of those dated days, somebody had been in that house, and it had been me. And I thought about what kind of person you would have to be to keep records like these for 7 years, if you were planning all along to rob a dying woman. You don't document a crime in your own handwriting. You don't save the receipts. You keep a shoebox like this for exactly one reason, because you love someone, and some quiet, frightened part of you suspects that one day you might have to prove it to people who never bothered to watch. Mr. Calloway looked through it all and said the thing I needed to hear. "Keep everything," he told me. "Let the paper speak. You don't have to say a word in your own defense. The dates will say it for you." He tapped the lid. "A woman who manipulates her mother doesn't keep 7 years of receipts she never expected anyone to read. This is the opposite of what they'll accuse you of. Let the paper speak." So I had the paper, 7 years of it, and I had a letter and a trust no one could touch. Then the call came that I didn't expect. It was Celeste, and her voice was smooth again, the public voice, the one for cameras. "There's a board meeting Thursday," she said. "About the foundation. Things have gotten complicated with Mama's estate, and the board needs to understand the situation. They're expecting the money she left Francis. I told them it was coming. So you're going to come, and you're going to sit in front of people who have known and respected this family for 30 years. And you're going to explain to them why you're sitting on the money that saves the thing our grandfather built." A pause, and then the knife under the silk. "The foundation Mama built is dying, and you're holding what saves it. Come explain that to the board." She wanted an audience for my number. I understood exactly what she was doing. She would put me in a room full of Wexford's most respected people, the people whose good opinion she lived on, and she would stand in the warm light of all that respect and paint me as the bitter, small daughter letting the family legacy die out of spite. The stain, withholding. She had built that room my whole life. She was good at it. But this time, when I walked into the room she'd built, I wasn't going to walk in alone, and I wasn't going to walk in empty-handed. I called Garrett Lowell. I asked him if a trustee could attend a meeting like that. "I can," he said, "and I will. I'll put it on the record, plainly, so there's no confusion in that room. The trust cannot fund the foundation. Not because you won't allow it, because she wouldn't. That's not your choice, Francis, and it isn't mine. It's hers." I packed the shoebox. I packed the letter. I packed the notarized pages. They'd set the room. I was going to bring the floor. The foundation's board met in a conference room on the second floor of the old bank building, 7 chairs around a long table, a portrait of my grandfather on the wall, and a brass plate by the door that read, "Hargrove Foundation." Celeste was already performing when I walked in. She had the head of the table again, and she was mid-sentence, and the sentence was about sacrifice. "And I have carried this family and this foundation alone, for years, while certain people were nowhere to be found," she was saying, her voice rich with wounded patience. She turned as I came in, and her face arranged itself into something between sorrow and welcome for the benefit of the 7 people watching. And now I'm being put in the position of asking my own sister to do the right thing. I won't be shaken down by the one who never showed up. It worked, for a minute. I watched it work. I saw the board members glance at me, the divorced one, the aide, the one in the plain coat, and I saw them lean, just slightly, toward the woman they knew, the woman who gave the speeches. She was good, I'll give her that, even now. She didn't argue numbers, she didn't get defensive. She stood in front of those 7 people and told them a story about a family, about a sister who'd vanished for years and reappeared the moment there was money on the table, and she let the story do the work. She mentioned, almost in passing, the years she'd carried Mama's affairs. She mentioned the gala and the scholarships and the library wing with our name on the door. She built, right there in that room, the same picture she had been building my entire life. The devoted daughter, the steady one, and somewhere off at the soft edge of the frame, the embarrassment. The one you explained. I let her. My mother's voice was in my ear the whole time. Stand still. Let the truth do what the truth does. So I sat with my coat folded over the shoebox in my lap, and I said nothing. And I watched the finest performance of my sister's life land on a room that wanted to believe every word of it. For a moment, the room believed her. But there was one man at that table who wasn't leaning. Walter Pennington sat halfway down the side with a folder open in front of him and a crease between his eyebrows, and he kept glancing down at a page and then up at Celeste and then down again. Garrett Lowell spoke first, calm and brief, and said the thing he'd promised to say. That the trust was irrevocable, that it could not by its own terms be used for the foundation, and that this was the instruction of the woman who'd created it. Full stop. The room took that in. Celeste opened her mouth to reframe it, and that was when Walter, of all people, sank her. And the terrible thing, the thing I'll remember, is that he was trying to help her. Celeste, Hold on, he said, frowning at his folder. I've been trying to make sense of these numbers all week, just to be able to explain the shortfall to everybody, and I keep getting turned around. He turned a page. These transfers out of the program account. I thought it was a bookkeeping thing, a few entries, but it's not a few entries. These go back 4 years. He looked up, and his voice did something it hadn't done before. It slowed and got quiet, the way a voice gets when a person is understanding something even as they say it. 4 years, Celeste, and they're all your signature, every one of them. He hadn't meant to. You could see it on him. He'd opened that folder to defend her, and the folder had answered a question nobody was supposed to ask. He sat back slowly, the page still in his hand, and looked at my sister with something I can only call grief. Not anger, grief. The particular grief of a decent man finding out that someone he had vouched for had been using his good name as cover. Walter Pennington had put 20 years of his reputation behind this foundation. He had told donors it was sound. He had signed things on faith. And now he sat there, holding 4 years of that misplaced faith in black and white in her handwriting, and you could watch what it cost him to keep holding it. He meant to clear it up. He didn't. The board chair, a woman named Diane who'd known my grandfather, took the folder from Walter's hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached over and pressed a button on the phone in the center of the table. I have someone we should hear from, Diane said. A speaker crackled. A woman's voice came through, a little thin over the line. Joan Whitlock, the accountant who'd kept the foundation's books, the one who had walked away. I wondered when you'd call, Joan said. The missing accountant had never really been missing. I flagged this last quarter, Joan Whitlock said. Her voice over the speaker was steady and unhappy. I went to your director privately, before I went anywhere else, and I told her the books didn't balance and that I couldn't sign off. When the answer I got was that I should find a way to make it work, I resigned the engagement. I don't put my name on numbers I can't stand behind. Diane asked her to walk the board through it. Joan did, in the flat voice of someone reading from records she'd memorized because they'd kept her up at night. She kept going, because nobody told her to stop. She walked them through how it had been done. Money moved out of the scholarship account into a holding account, then out of the holding account to a vendor that, when anyone bothered to look, turned out to share a mailing address with a property my sister half-owned. She named the months. She named the amounts. None of them quite big enough to trip a review on its own, all of them adding up to the same place. She described the year-end statements that had been adjusted so the totals would land where they were supposed to land. And the whole time she talked, the only sound in that room, besides her thin voice over the speaker, was the soft riffle of 7 people turning the same pages in the same packet at the same time, finding the dates for themselves. I watched Diane's face go from polite attention to something stiller and harder. I watched the man beside Walter take his glasses off, set them on the table, and rub the bridge of his nose like the numbers had given him a headache. I watched a woman across from me press her lips into a line and glance up at the portrait of my grandfather on the wall, and then look away from it, as if she couldn't quite meet his painted eye on the foundation's behalf. Nobody was leaning toward my sister anymore. Over 4 years, money was moved out of the program account. the account for scholarships and grants, through 3 different accounts in amounts small enough not to trip the annual review. The total is $615,000 unaccounted for. The dates are in the packet I left with the board last quarter. Beyond that, the foundation has been operating insolvent for at least 2 years. The real shortfall, once you net it all, is about $2.1 million. The gala didn't cover it. The annual appeal didn't cover it. Nothing covered it. The books were made to look like they did. $615,000, 3 accounts, 4 years. The numbers slid across that table one after another, and nobody at the table moved. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. I'd brought the shoebox and the letter and the pages, and I'd been ready to spread all 7 years of my mornings across that table to prove I was no thief. But it turned out I never needed to open the box. The thief was already in the room, and she had signed her own name on every page. My sister tried, one last time, to be the woman in the warm light. "You don't understand how a foundation actually works," she said, and she looked around the table for the nods she'd always gotten. "These are timing differences, cash flow. Any nonprofit of this size," nobody helped her finish the sentence. The nods didn't come, and her hands, which my whole life had been in motion, drumming, smoothing, gesturing, always moving, went flat on the table and stopped. White at the knuckles, still. Her hands finally went still. Diane set a single sheet of paper in front of herself. It was a letter on bank letterhead, and she read the relevant part aloud in a voice that had gone very quiet. The bank was calling the loan. The foundation was in default of its covenants. There would be an audit, and the matter would be referred. There was a deadline, and the deadline was now. It was dated weeks back, which meant that on the morning, my sister stood over our mother's casket and told a grieving town the foundation had never been stronger. This letter, or one just like it, had already been sitting in her desk. She had stood at the grave and lied to every person in that church, with the truth folded up at home. And in the silence after she finished, I watched the understanding move around that table, from face to face, and I watched it arrive at the same place for every one of them. "Now I understand the clause," Diane said softly, almost to herself. She looked down the table toward me, and then at the empty chair where my mother might once have sat. Adeline wasn't punishing anyone. She wasn't being cruel to her own daughter. She set the bank's letter down. She was protecting this foundation from her. My mother's sentence, the one I hadn't understood in the lawyer's office, suddenly made sense to every person in the room. What happened next happened fast, and I'm going to tell it the way it felt. Quick and quiet and final. Diane called the question. All in favor of removing the executive director, effective immediately. Hands went up around the table. One, then the next, then all of them. Walter raised his last and slowest, and he didn't look at Celeste when he did it. It was done in under a minute. A motion to remove her. A motion to refer the records to the state and to the foundation's attorneys. The scrape of a chair, the soft clap of a binder closing. Someone read the vote into the minutes. Someone else wrote down the time. Diane asked that it be noted the keys and the accounts would be surrendered by end of day. Nobody reached for a gentler word. Nobody offered her one. Celeste did not cry. I'll give her that too. She gathered her things with hands that had finally gone quiet. She picked up her folder. She left the bank's letter on the table because it wasn't hers to carry out of that room. None of it was hers now. The pillar didn't fall. It was lowered. My brother stood up. Russell, who had laughed at the dishes, who had flown in to collect his share, got to his feet and stepped back from the table, back from her, and put himself nearer the door. He didn't stand with his sister. In the end, nobody did. And here is the thing I came to that room not knowing I would feel. She wasn't my sister in that room anymore. Not the way that word is supposed to mean something. She was Celeste Hargrove, and the only thing she had ever truly owned, that name, polished and lifted up and carried through this town like a banner, was the one thing she could not save. The minutes would not say, "My sister." The minutes would say, "The executive director, removed, effective immediately." For 49 years, I had been told I was the stain on the family name. I sat very still in that bright room, the way my mother told me to, and I watched the name go looking for its real stain. It was not me. I didn't say much. There wasn't anything left to say that the paper hadn't already said better. I gathered the shoebox I never had to open and stood up. "I'm done here," I said to Mr. Calloway. "Thank you." That was all. I didn't raise my voice once. Out in the hallway, it was cold, the way old buildings are cold in the stairwell, and I realized I'd left my coat on the back of the chair. Before I could turn around, Walter Pennington was there, holding it out to me. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? He just helped me into my coat the way you'd help anyone, and held the stair door, and that small, ordinary kindness undid me more than anything that had happened inside. There was still one thing I had to do, and it was mine, alone. If you've made it this far with me, then I think you already understand what kind of person stays for 7 years and never says a word about it. Maybe you've been that person. Maybe you're that person right now. The one a family decided didn't count, the one who showed up anyway. If you are, I'd like to hear about it. Leave it down below, in your own words. Somewhere out there is another person who stayed, who needs to read that they weren't the only one. Because here's how it ended for me, not in that room. A few days later, at my own kitchen table, I wrote 2 letters of my own. I'm not a dramatic person, and I didn't write anything dramatic. I wrote my brother a short note that left a door open, narrow but open, because he is still my brother, and because my mother didn't raise me to slam doors, only to decide who walks through them and when. I wrote my sister a shorter one. I told her the truth, which is that I'm not building a wall against her. I'm building a door, and I'm the one who decides who comes through it and when and on what terms. If she ever knocks for the right reasons, she'll find it isn't locked. Until then, it stays shut. That's not cruelty. That's just mine to decide now. I set the pen down. On the shelf above the table, behind glass, sat the bone china with the gold edge, still waiting for company. I left it there. Some things are content to be looked at. And then I did what I do every morning. I put the kettle on. I took down a plain white plate, thick at the rim, chipped where it cracked against the faucet a long time ago. I made my coffee, and I sat down in the early light, coming through the kitchen window and out past the glass. The little pond behind the house was flat and still, not a ripple on it. I ran my thumb along the chip in the rim, the way I have 1,000 mornings, and somewhere underneath the quiet I could still hear it. 2 taps of a spoon against a bowl, a voice telling me to come down, breakfast's ready. The trust is just money. My mother wrote that, and she was right. I haven't done much with it. I paid off the small house I'd been renting, so the kitchen I sit in every morning is mine now. And I kept my work, because the work was never the shameful thing they made it out to be. It was the realest thing I knew how to do. The 2 million sits where she put it, quiet and out of anyone's reach, the way she liked things kept. It turns out, the money was never the inheritance. The money was just proof. Proof that someone had been keeping count, on all the mornings nobody else was looking, of exactly who showed up and who didn't. Plain dishes, they still know my hands. People ask me sometimes, when they hear a piece of this, whether it was worth it. 7 years. The phone that didn't ring. The laughter in the lawyer's office. They got the house. They got the silver and the gold-edged china and the speeches and the applause and the good name, right up until the day the name wouldn't hold their weight anymore. I got the mornings. I always had.